Welcome back. We're beginning a new unit today on moral development. This is going to be the first part, and we're going to look at some areas of some psychological theories about how people develop senses of morality and how that develops over time, particularly during the adolescent period. So before beginning, I'm just going to a little caveat. If I'm a little bit hard to understand or I seem to be garbling or slurring my words, I just had dental surgery yesterday. So, I have a little bit of rawness in my mouth, and so if it doesn't sound clear, let me know if it's not coming through. Um, but let's go over our just roadmap. So the first thing we're going to look at is this kind of notion that moral reasoning is dependent on cognitive ability, which means, in a sense, the smarter you are, the more developed your brain is, the higher levels of moral reasoning you're able to engage in, which means that the reason why children have simple or simplistic moral reasoning is because their cognitive ability hasn't caught up. They can't abstract, they can't generalize their ideas, and until they're able to do that, they can't really have an adult moral ability. And the idea that as your cognitive ability develops over time, your ability to morally reason will also develop over the time. Part of this is the idea of why we don't hold minors responsible to the same levels of culpability for criminal actions as we do for adults, so that they're not able to actually make these moral decisions in an effective way. The second thing we're going to do is review some theories of moral development. Some of these we have seen before, Piaget, who not only did things with cognitive development, but did a lot of things about observing children playing games and talking to these children about what were the rules of the games and how they understood the rules of the games. Kohlberg, and also Gilligan, who we saw when we discussed gender in our previous unit. And lastly, I think, and this is the biggest picture, is that, it kind of begs the question of whether morality is something that's universal. The idea that our minds are all the same, no matter where we are, no matter what culture we belong to, is that if our brains are the same and our reasoning is the same and we think the same, then our moral principles should be the same as well, because everyone can understand the same moral principles. And this has gone back and forth, not so much in psychology, but in philosophy, that the idea if our minds are kind of independent, our minds are universally shared, our feelings, our ability to know things are shared among all human beings, then there should be also universal morality once we strip away all the particularities of our culture. And so the psychological exploration kind of brings this question up again, based on some more empirical findings. And particularly Piaget and Kohlberg seem to support the notion that there is a universal morality, and it's just a matter of whether everyone achieves that level of understanding of it. While Gilligan kind of says, well, there's more than one moral system out there, and it really depends on your background and some types of your social environment. So that being said, let's begin. So what is moral development? And moral development, I think, is looking at three different areas. The first one is how people think. So the idea that if I give you a moral problem, how do you reason through that problem? So for example, if I present, let's say, a situation in front of you, I might ask you what would be the reasoning for your decisions, what is right, what is wrong, and then I would ask you why it's right and wrong, and what types of principles are you using? Are you using a sense of fairness? Are you using a sense of justice? And basically, this is abstracted from any practical application. So the point is that when we think about moral problems, it's different than how we might behave in moral problems. So we could see someone who would say that lying is wrong, but actually their behavior, they might lie in their actual behavior, so there might be an inconsistency there. But we can separate the investigation into how people think from how they behave. So the second part is the behavior that people engage in, which is when we look at adolescents, how do they behave in moral circumstances? So for example, we can look at them, and probably the most common, just because the connection to school, is how do they take a test? Do they take a test differently if they are observed, which means that there's a proctor in the room? Do they take a test differently if they know the consequences of their actions? Like if one person is found cheating, then the entire room fails, versus if one person is cheating, that the consequences only apply to one person, and how they're being observed. So there's a lot of different things where there's been experiments looking at different situations and how people act under these different situations. One great example of this is that they do this experiment all around the world where they drop wallets in various street corners. Looks like a wallet with cash and various other things into it. And they have a video camera on that street corner to watch to see what happens when people retrieve this wallet. Do they turn it in? Do they take the money out? Do they steal the identity? And just seeing how different people in different places in the world react to the same problem. And I think there's a lot of fascinating results from that. Um, the last thing is, about feelings, which means it's not about how you made the decision, but how you feel about the decisions being made, which means that you might know that cheating on a test is wrong, but the question is that do you feel like it's wrong and I can get caught and get punished from it, but I don't feel anything that's bad about it. And just one example that just came up recently about academic honesty is the use of online resources. And I find there's a very big generational difference in this, that if someone solved the problem that you're given and the answer is online, if you copy the answer, like for a math problem, is that cheating or not? And I find that people who are older generally have said, yes, it's cheating. You didn't. It doesn't reflect your work. You didn't do this. I have talked to younger people, and they will say, look, I was smart enough to be able to find the answer online. It shows that I was resourceful, and I was able to find the resources to find the answer that you were asking me. So even though I didn't know how to do the math problem, I knew how to find out the answer to the math problem, and that should count for something. And the second thing is that when they see things like essays that you can purchase online or websites like chegg.com and things of that sort where people will solve the problem for you for a price, they don't feel that it is plagiarism in the way that maybe an older generation does. And so it might be interesting to look at why people have different feelings about moral matters. Some people, like another good example of this is how people react to getting speeding tickets. Some people say, look, yes, I was speeding, I was wrong. I should be punished for this because I know that speeding or drinking while driving puts other people at risk. There's other people who will look at it and say, well, yes, I was speeding, but everyone else was speeding. Why am I getting punished for this? And other people feel like, hey, if you don't get pulled over, you weren't doing anything wrong. So if you drive 120 miles an hour down to the Taconic Highway, Taconic Parkway, but you didn't get pulled over by a cop, then that means that you weren't doing anything wrong. But if you were going 5 miles over the speed limit and you get pulled over by the cop, then you were doing something wrong. So we have kind of how people react to the consequences and whether they feel, and this is more about, do they feel the public system of morality is fair? And so the people looked at these in all three different levels of moral development. So let's begin with Jean Piaget. So Piaget did a lot of work with cognitive development in children, and when I teach childhood psychology, he's becomes one of the more influential theories on this. But he also looked at the moral development of children, and he usually did this by watching children playing simple games, and particularly playing a game called marbles. And he would see them play, and he would then ask these children one-on-one to explain things were happening. So things like cheating, someone stealing someone else's marbles, what kind of punishments by adults were fair, what's fair and what's not fair. And you could have done this with any game, like playing a pickup basketball game, how fouls are called. You could do this for a game where it's sharing toys. You could do this with personal space. You could do this with like certain levels of teasing. And what Piaget just really was doing is observation and just saying, I want to understand how these children explain these actions and what is their sense of fairness in their own minds, rather than in a sense to try to go through into their minds and study the neurobiochemistry, neurology that was underneath that. And he basically identified two different types of moralities. And the first, and you probably have heard heterogeneous, but this heteronomous morality, meaning hetero meaning divergent, which means that the morality comes from outside or from diverse sources, while autonomous morality comes from the inside, one's own principles. And heteronomous morality is basically that the ideas of justice are part of the properties of the world. So there's no difference between the law, meaning justice and the rules, and the law of gravity. That justice and rules are basically properties of the world. So if you do something wrong, what's going to happen is there's going to be a punishment. So if you steal a cookie, even if no one sees it, there's some type of boogeyman that knows that and is going to punish you for that. If you hurt someone, or if you write something down that's nasty or mean to someone, that somehow that has a reality to it that can have a real impact and bring back bad karma to you. And so the idea is that these things are not in their control. They come from the outside. They're just like properties of nature. And no matter what you want to do, um, that these things are not controllable. They're not in your control. Autonomous morality, which generally develops, he said, at a later age, so 7-10, late elementary school, is that you become that these rules and laws are created by people, which means that you might have been told, for example, naughty and nice, you get things like gift giving season like Santa Claus or the Easter Bunny or the Tooth Fairy, and these are things that they're just these things, that entities that happen, and they record all your actions. And then you realize that these people might be your parents. And the way that they apply the rules and the way they make exceptions to the rules, and that there are different rules out there that are chosen by different parents or different people or different adults, is that these rules are humanly created, and therefore they're somewhat, in a sense, negotiable. And you can start, in a sense, developing your own rules. You can start judging them, like instead of taking it as a given, you can basically go through and try to recreate the thought process that would make something moral or immoral. The other key thing is that we don't just look at the consequences, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in the next slide. You look at someone's intentions. So one great example of this is that I saw a small child kick a heavy ball, and the child decided to kick the ball. So the child took on the action, and let's say the ball was kind of hard and they hurt themselves and they stubbed their toe. And the child was there, like, was hurt, and says, "Bad ball, you did this to me." As if like blaming the universe for the actions, which means it was bad because they were hurting. But the point about it is that the rock or the ball had no intentions. So what happens is that instead of whether something ended badly, you can say whether someone caused it to do that. So you get the idea, like, it's not that you hurt my feelings, or it's not that I didn't get what I wanted. It's that you intended to do that. You were being mean, you were being selfish, and you start to see moral actions in terms of intentionality instead of just consequences. So to go a little bit more on this, heteronomous morality, you judge the rightness or goodness of behavior by considering the consequences and not the intentions of the individual, which means a good example of this is that if you break 12 things by accident, that's much worse than if you broke one thing on purpose. Does that make sense? So like, if I didn't mean to bump you, it doesn't matter whether I meant to bump you or not. The fact that you were bumped is what really bothers you. And you see sometimes this with a child, which is that when they're frustrated or they're kept from getting what they want or their intentions, or if they fall or get hurt, it's how much it hurts them, and not whether like the person meant to hurt them. And so there's really like every parent has done this. When you're putting a child into a car seat and the child doesn't want to be in the car seat and they're frustrated, they don't look at the intentionality of the parent that, look, I'm trying to protect you. The second thing that I kind of mentioned before is this idea that punishment is, there is a God out there, and that imminent justice means justice is all around you and justice is going to occur immediately. So think of this in terms of instant karma. That the way that small children act is that if a rule is broken, that you're going to get punished pretty quickly. And so there's a lot of anxiety when they break a rule, which is, even if it's something simple like step on a crack, break your mother's back, they feel like when they step on a crack that it's going to happen immediately and irrevocably. My wife famously thought that if you didn't buckle your seatbelts, the car wouldn't move. And therefore that there was a direct relationship between following the rules as told to you and the punishment related to that. And so what sometimes is when they break a rule or they're aware of it, there's an anxiety about the punishment, even though there's no punishment coming. And it kind of like this is that, as I was saying before, that the laws of morality and the laws of like physics, like the law of gravity, are kind of the same thing. And when you, just like you can't negotiate with the law of gravity, you can't break with the laws of morality either. You can't negotiate with the laws of morality either. That punishment is automatic. And kind of on this is that when bad things happen to you, it's because you deserve them. Which means is that if you did something bad, you're getting bad luck. So if you hurt someone else's feelings or you stole someone's things, that like you're going to get punished in some way. So very often you see with smaller children is that If they say something like, I hate you, parents. If you've ever seen the movie Home Alone, where he goes, I wish my family would disappear, and then the next morning when his family disappears, he thinks it's what he said is that what made that happen. And so you get a lot of like anxiety in the sense that there's a sense that you have control over things, but that also that like once you break the rules or you step out of the line or you cross like out of your pen or you're breaking the rules that you're going to get punished in some way. That there's a cause and effect between the action and the reaction. Autonomous morality is that you see that these rules are more malleable, that these rules can change, that these rules can be negotiated, which is that the rules are not like the law of gravity, that these rules are kind of conventions, which means that, yes, there's a rule that we have to go to bed by 8 p.m., but I can ask my parents to extend bedtime by 30 minutes. And you realize that you can start to negotiate rules like that. You might, for example, know that you're supposed to eat your vegetables before dessert, but you might say, look, you might negotiate, say, well, if I'm really good and behave, can I have dessert first, and then I will eat my peas and carrots. Um, so what you see is that these rules are conveniences. They are socially agreed upon, which means the rules because people make them rules, but there's nothing inherent in them that makes them permanent or, as I said, like the laws of physics. And what you then, knowing that, is that you start to understand, you start to try to understand there must be a logic to the rules, which means my parent wants me to do this because it keeps me safe, or my parent wants to do this because it's fairness, or I should share because I want someone to share with me. And they start to, and sometimes these rules are more apparent, so they try to reconstruct the abstraction, and you might see them thinking it through like, okay, does this make sense? But you also might, if they enter a situation where they don't know the rules, is that they might become deductive, like, and you can kind of see this sometimes when you're training pets, where they see one pet, if you have two pets and one pet is rewarded, the other pet will be watching to see, okay, the other animal, dog, cat, whatever, got what it wanted when it did this. If I do this, will it happen? And you'll see kind of kids experimenting in the same way to try to understand what the rules are. So they might see what happens when they throw a tantrum. They might see what happens when they try to open a door or pick up something they're not supposed to have. And they see, okay, well, my parents didn't react on this situation, but they did react on that situation. And they might, in a sense, empirically try to figure out what the rules are. So kind of a development on Piaget, something called cognitive disequilibrium theory, was developed by Martin Hoffman in 1980. And the key thing here is that it's how lived experience impacts how people see what is right and wrong. So what's happening in adolescence is that, we've talked about this before, is that you're becoming more aware, you can think more abstract, your ability to empathize can be depressed during a certain period to develop later on. Your judgment can be kind of short-circuited. But one of the key things that's happening in terms of lived experience is that you're going from environments that are pretty homogeneous, which means in elementary school everyone is the same age. Generally, because elementary schools are very local, everyone is from the same neighborhood. People probably have the same background, whether affluence, racial background, ethnic background, linguistic background. And as you get to high school and adolescent years, and then later to college, as you're going to start interacting with people who have very different backgrounds than your family does or your neighborhood. And therefore, you're going to interact with various different forms of morality, different types of styles, different types of preferences, and you have to resolve these moral rules. Like, for example, that your parents might have a rule saying drugs are bad, but then you see another parents where they're kind of more lax on that. You might see one person with rules about drinking alcohol, or staying out late, or wearing a certain color, or studying. And once you start to realize that not everyone is following the same rules that your parents have laid down, you cognitively, what you're observing is different than what you've been told. And so the disequilibrium is between what you take as a given, the laws of morality is given from your parents and from your teachers and other authority figures, and the laws that you're observing that maybe the world doesn't fit the way it is. So if your parents say, look, the world is just, and if you work hard, you'll get rewarded, and then you see people who are getting rewarded that are not working hard, you might decide, well, something has to be resolved here. Either you reject the morality as you received it, or you, in a sense, like, you know what, working hard has nothing to do with being rewarded. Or you might say that there's something wrong with the morality outside and it needs to be changed because you want to reemphasize your sense of right and wrong. What this also kind of creates is a questioning of belief systems. And very often you see a transition in as adolescents encounter more different people with different backgrounds, different sexualities, different ethical systems, different linguistic systems. It's more pluralistic, and they might become more, in a sense, tolerant of people who have different systems of morality than they do. You might also see this in terms of religious differences, where in an elementary school you might see most people with the same religious background, but when you when you become an adult after bar mitzvah or confirmation in Catholicism, is where you have adult responsibilities. Is that you are more indoctrinated into your parent or cultural religious background and beliefs, but you also interact with people who have different belief systems, and sometimes those become more apparent, whether people can date across religious or class or ethnic lines and things of that sort, or whether people behave or dress in a certain way, or eat or don't eat certain items. You are curious and you try to figure out what is the underlying logic underneath that belief and morality system. So this brings us to our second one, which is a second theorist, which is Kohlberg. And Kohlberg really does build on Piaget, but I think Kohlberg, while Piaget was very empirical, that he was trying to describe something he was observing, Kohlberg has more of an abstract theory about this, which means Kohlberg I don't think is built so much upon observations of actual individuals, but kind of in a sense systemizing of things that are consistent with kind of Piaget's system. And in some ways I feel like Kohlberg is reconstructing something that you might get out of philosophy in different levels, indicating, or it's more anthropological, which means in the past people had more simple moral systems. As people come into more complex and more modern situations, their moral systems are more complex to deal with kind of the more diversity of situations. So what Kohlberg would say is that moral development is based on moral reasoning, and moral reasoning unfolds just like Piaget in a series of stages, which means you go through these stages one at a time, and you only can go these stages from 1 to 2, 2 to 3. You can't jump stages. In some ways, you want to think about this as like kind of kind of a system of reincarnation, where you have to start at one caste level, and then you get promoted, and then you get promoted, and you get promoted, and eventually you need to transcend the moral system. Kohlberg would also believe that your ability to moral reason is dependent upon your cognitive ability. And so until your brain is able to handle certain things, you're unable to make some types of moral judgments. So we're going to just give the symbol model, and then we're going to talk about the stages within each of these levels. But the 3 levels that Kohlberg has are pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional. And so what does it mean? A pre-conventional person is that someone who shows no internalization of these moral values, which means these values are coming from the outside. It's all about external rewards and punishment, which means you don't accept the reasoning of the moral system, which means like I'll do this because I don't want to be punished, but I don't necessarily agree that it's the right thing or wrong thing to do. Which means is that you see that the moral system is something external to yourself, but you don't accept the principles of the moral system. And so that unless there is external rewards and punishments, and you might argue that this is kind of the moral system of a trained pet. If you reward me, I will do it. If you punish me, I won't do it. But when there's no rewards and punishments, I'm just going to do whatever I want. Conventional reasoning is that you have some internalization, which means that you might have a difference between a recognition that there's a self and others, and that you have your own internal standards, your own moral beliefs and reasons. And you might recognize that there are external standards and reasons, which means I have one set of morality, society has a different set of morality, and you understand that those are not one and the same. And so what you have in internalization is that you're going to have some of society's, let's say, values internalized and accepted into your individual morality, but you can also identify places where you don't accept the general morality of the larger society. And what the cognitive development here is this idea between self and others, which is that the world doesn't necessarily revolve around me. I understand there's other people. These other people have feelings. These other people have their own theory of mind, their own way of making decisions, and those are not the same as myself. Post-conventional reasoning is saying that you have a moral system that's completely internalized, but it's not based upon what other people say, which means you are kind of, in a sense, it's saying you're above peer pressure, which means you have your own set of principles and you're true to yourself. You march to the beat of your own drum, and you understand what your principles are, which means it's not just that you have a feeling about it, is that in your mind you rationalize and understand why you are doing some things and why certain things are moral, and you're willing to stand up against contrary moral positions by people from the larger society. And you also understand that there are other moral courses that people have. You have one set of morality, and you could say this is where you get the idea of between good and evil, which means my moral system is the best moral system. That's why I've chosen it. But there are alternative moral courses that other people have chosen and you have rejected, and that you are accepting a personal moral code. And whatever that code is, and people can have different codes. That's how you make your decisions about whether things are moral or immoral. So, in more detail, what is going on at the preconventional stage? So, as I said, Kohlberg is building upon Piaget, so you're going to see some of the same vocabulary here. The first stage is similar to what Piaget says: heteronomous morality. Moral thinking is tied to punishment. You obey children and adolescents obey adults because I told you so. And what I think is Kohlberg is that you can get stuck at one stage. So generally you would associate this type of morality with young children, but Kohlberg would say there's a possibility that you don't escape this stage, that you can be an adolescent and still have a childlike mentality on that. And I think that every high school teacher has had an experience where you've dealt with a student and you're trying to explain the reason why you're doing something, for example, whether the system of passes or going to the bathroom or something relatively simple. And very often the adolescent will not accept it, or will only do that if you say, look, if you don't do this, there's a punishment associated with that. So that's the most basic level, and you could say there are adults who sometimes regress into that level. But for Kohlberg, it's like the most basic level, and that you haven't, if you stay there, you haven't really progressed out of that. The second stage is more that you might call this golden rule morality, which means you do unto others because you want them to do something to you. So it's more of a tit for tat, and it's more what you might call instrumental, which means the reason why I'm nice to other people is not because it's a good thing to do, and it's not because I'm going to be punished or forced to do this. But I'm seeing this as an exchange or as a negotiation, which means I will do something nice for you, and there's an expectation of reciprocity that you will do something nice for me. So the golden rule is a good general principle, but it doesn't say what that is, right? You could have a golden rule that says I'm going to be nice to you because I want you to be nice to me, but you could also have a golden rule that its content is bad, which means I'm going to hurt other people because I don't care what they do to me. And that means it still is relatively instrumental, and it still is not very abstract, and it's very, in a sense, about the payoffs that you receive. So that's pre-conventional reasoning. The second level is conventional reasoning, and these are things where you might see you're not doing it for like rewards and punishments, but you're doing it for you might call emotional or solidaristic reasons, which means that you start to value things like I want to be trusted by someone, I want to care about people, there are people who I'm loyal to, and so you might see that I'm loyal to someone, like I know that my brother's sister is not doing something right, or maybe is in jail or criminal, but they're my brother or sister and I love them anyway. And we talked about this before about mother love and father love, which your mother loves you no matter what you do or whatever you did that you messed up. It's in a sense not judgmental, and it's more about the relationship that exists than what things people have done or whether they're good or bad. So the idea is that I want for my parent to think I'm a good person, and because I want them to be a good person, I'm going to use their moral standards, whatever those are. So, for example, my parents go to church. I don't really understand or agree with the religion, but I want them to think I'm a good person, so I'm going to get dressed up and go to church because that's what's expected of me, and they'll like that. Um, I might not accept my parents' table manners, but I know that good manners and saying certain things is what they expect of me, and so I'll do it because I want them to like me. And so this is more about you get to the level of understanding you're part of a group and wanting to be part of a group, and you can understand this in terms of adolescence and peer pressure, which is that I want to be liked by the members of this group, so that I will adopt this group's morality, even if I have reservations or not necessarily agree with that, or that it doesn't fit like a broader morality or some type of rule-based morality or principle-based morality, because I want people in this group. So we've all seen, particularly with we'll talk later about gangs, and we talked about cliques and friendships and peers and things of that sort before. But the idea is that whatever the morality of that group is becomes my morality, even if that you could say the morality of the group is destructive to me personally or destructive to society generally. The next stage of this is that we're all part of a society, and that the expression that humans are a social animal. And so there are things that you might not agree with, like it's not cosmic justice, but you realize that there's a pragmatism that we all have to live together, and so we have to give a little and get a little. And we understand for society to work effectively, we have laws, and these laws are sometimes imperfect, and that we need these laws to protect society. So, for example, we might not agree with what a police officer is doing, but we might agree that the police officer has the authority to do something. So the difference here is that we don't obey the police officer because the police officer has legitimate force, meaning a gun or the ability to arrest us. We understand the police officer is an agent of society and is helping, let's say, the social system work. Even if we think that the judgment or whoever they're arresting is a mistake. So the point is that they're arresting someone that I think is right, but I understand that's their job and that's what they have to do. You might say this in terms of like students and teachers. Students accept that teachers have to make certain decisions to make a classroom run, even if it's a decision that is adverse to the individual student. So the last level is, and Kohlberg would say not everyone reaches this last level, is what he might call post-conventional reasoning, which is that you have a more abstract idea of understanding what morality is. So this might mean like you're operating on the sense of a political theorist or a political philosopher. You understand, let's say, the social contract, and you root your own individual judgments in some type of more abstract system. So I might have a sense of a system of justice. I might call it Rawlsian justice. I might call it utilitarianism. I might call it patriotism. But the point is that I understand my individual decisions in a larger system. Like it might be a system of rights. It might be a constitutional government. It might be, for example, the idea of a First and Second Amendment. And so, but you also understand that these are laws, and that laws have changed, and laws can be invalid. So, for example, the idea that you can have an unjust law. So, if you have a system of a social contract, I should say social contact, you can say, well, the government has passed an illegitimate law, and the government doesn't have a right under this understanding of its purpose to pass that kind of law. So, so the government might pass, like, say, universal healthcare legislation, but you might say that that's not fair because it violates the property rights of the people being taxed to support it, and therefore it's an illegitimate law that can't be passed, and therefore it doesn't have a moral claim on you. But still, this is in terms of individual society. So a social contract or individual rights are guaranteed in a particular constitution, a particular political system, usually a nation. And then we can think about things that are right because they are universally right, which means no matter where you live, no matter where you are, there is a sense of right and wrong. So just the question is, whether do you have free speech because it's in the United States Constitution, or whether you have free speech because that's a universal ethical principle that needs to be accepted. So when you've developed a moral standard based on, let's say, universal human rights, when those rights are being violated in somewhere else in the world that is not directly impacting you, even when they don't have any constitutional government living under a totalitarian or authoritarian government or theocracy, um, you can understand and you might decide the person who opposes those laws, kind of, let's say, civil disobedience or non-cooperation, is that there is a higher morality compared to following the law. So, for example, someone like Gandhi or Martin Luther King, when they are arrested or when they are punished by authorities, you don't think that they are wrong. You think that they're following a higher morality that is transcendent or goes beyond that. And so this is where you see people being dissenters from social norms. And a lot of this is, the idea of following a conscience. And some people root this in terms of a religious view of the world. Some people view this in terms of a natural rights. Some people root this in some type of universal understanding of what are human beings and what is the basis of human dignity that needs to be protected. So some criticisms of Kohlberg is that it really does not account for cultural differences. And this became a kind of a great political debate at the end of the Cold War, when it was kind of that Western style democracy and capitalism were the winning value systems. And you saw a lot of people, particularly in East Asia, saying, look, Western morality is only one kind of morality, that there's a different sense of morality that might be based in Confucian or Buddhist or other cultural standards. And therefore they can't be judged by outsiders. And so people like Kohlberg kind of assumes that everyone has the same mind, everyone has the same psychology, everyone goes through the same process. And so the idea is that everyone should get to an idea of universal human rights as long as they continue along this path. And many people said, well, that's not the case, because you could have, you might say Islamic fundamentalism was a rejection of Western universal human rights. You can see this in terms of places like Singapore and Japan, which have different cultures and different ways of understanding things. And you have cultures that really don't have a word for right. Like, right is a word that comes out of a Western vocabulary. And when you saw early movements toward democracy and constitutional government in East Asia, they had a lot of trouble just translating the word right, or even translating the word democracy, which it's not that they don't have a word. They can render it in their own language, but it doesn't always have the same meaning as it might have in, let's say, a Western context, that they don't have the same political theory. And this kind of indicates that there's not a universal psychology or mind or morality that is based upon the similarity that all humans share, a psychology and a mind. A second criticism of Kohlberg, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in a second, is that it doesn't really account for gender differences. And we talked a little bit about this when we talked about Carol Gilligan, is that Carol Gilligan says, and this, remember, as I said, under the gender unit, it's not male and female. It's not that all men think one way and all female think a different way about moral questions, but there might be a clear masculine and feminine, meaning a masculine style way of sorting through moral decisions and a feminine way of sorting through moral decisions, and these are distinct and equally valid. A third criticism is that Kohlberg kind of sets up what you might call a stage theory, which means that this is not just a neutral pathway that people go from one stage to another that reflects their cognitive ability. That actually, there's kind of a judgment level that pre-conventional morality isn't just first, it's also lowest. And post-conventional morality is not just last, but it's the highest. And it's the idea that if you get to post-conventional morality, you are a more moral person than someone who makes decisions based on a conventional or pre-conventional moral system. And that indicates that some people are just better or more moral, and it's not just, let's say, a developmental process. And this is where I think that Kohlberg becomes very it's inherently a judgmental system, and it assumes a universal standard and a universal process of which there's not necessarily a lot of empirical support that this universal process exists. So let's talk a little bit more about Carol Gilligan. And Carol Gilligan, in a series of books, In a Different Voice is probably the most famous. It came out in 1982. I would strongly recommend reading it. I think it's a provocative book, even though I think subsequent research has strengthened it or challenged, the original presentation. But I think this is a good way to think about things, and I think Carol Gilligan has been rightly influential. Um, and she's basically outlined two different perspectives: a justice perspective that looks at morality as a series of rights and rules, and that, and I described this in the gender lesson, is that boys seem very comfortable with, in the sense that there are games, and life is like a game, and there are rules to the game, and the game has winners and losers. And if you win or lose, and if you follow the rules, there's winners or losers, and winners are entitled to whatever their winnings are, and losers are punished. And this is perfectly fine. And it's okay if the losers are really feeling bad about it, or they're disadvantaged. It basically sets justice as a system of following these rules. And in the set of rules, everyone is accorded certain rights, and as long as those rights are protected, the outcome, no matter how monstrous, is still a just outcome. Which means that it's okay to have poor in the world if we assume a capitalist system which gives people certain rights and allocates, let's say, wealth based upon these processes and these rules. The poor have no complaint, and the wealthy have no obligation. Now, a care perspective is one that says that we're all connected, and we're all human beings, and we have relationships with each other, and that these relationships are important, independent about winning and losing or following the rules. That might be more rooted not in human rights, but in human dignity. That I don't want to see people humiliated. I don't want to see people's feelings hurt. And I talked about one of my own experiences where I had a game where the students had to allocate points and then had to vote on it, and whoever got the most votes got to allocate the points in the room to different students. And the boys in the class played it very much by a justice perspective, which means they had no problem giving 0 points to a lot of the individuals in the class, and basically taking all the points and giving them to the winners. While females did similar, except that instead of giving people 0 points, they made sure everyone had at least 1 point, which means that you didn't want to hurt someone's feelings by giving them 0. And therefore, they seem to be reasoning in more of a care perspective that makes sure that everyone is taken care of, people are not humiliated, and people are not left with nothing. So some concluding thoughts. I just think that one thing this provokes is morality universal or particular? A universal morality is basically saying that because we all have a mind, because every human being has a psychology, and the more we understand about psychology, we will be able to build a universal morality once we fully understand individual psychology. And therefore we can then judge people because we know how their mind works, and we know what moral systems are out there. And therefore, once we strip away everything, the appearances, culture, development, upbringing, socialization, we can identify universal morality that is not just for us, but should be able to be applied to everyone. And I think ever since the French Revolution, the idea of universal human rights or a universal standard or universal system has always been attractive, particularly in the area of political theory. But I think that this doesn't accept that there's a diversity out there, or an understanding of that people have different moral systems. Now, this is not to say that any moral system is okay, just because people follow it. It doesn't mean that you can't make judgments about other people, but I think there has to be a recognition that there's more than one system out there, and that psychology is not going to give us the ability to basically rule out other people's morality, in the sense that psychology is a science, and that science can inform what values you choose. So I think the thing is that psychology can be suggestive, but it can't be determinative. It doesn't make final decisions about what is right and wrong, but it can help us understand how people make those decisions and how those develop over time. So we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the applications about moral development in the adolescent years in our next video lecture, which will be coming out later this week. So until then, have a good time and stay safe.